This presentation considers some implications of the superimposition of the Sloterdijk position as we uptake it from the Zizek-Sloterdijk discussion in the so-called Indigo meeting in uh, Slovenia in the capital in I think last month, probably in October. Um, so, how does the pattern of our thinking change if we look at things through the lens of um, conscience as against community? So we have there's a nice I think the most um, simple example of this in the Platonic works is at the end of Hippias Major, the final word of Socrates, where he says, "You, Hippias, and others like you are often accusing me of merely reducing a hodgepodge of wild and interesting um, investigations, and also, in addition, not Hippias was famous for being the sophist who made the most money at applying his trade in the archipelago of Polis in the Greek world at the time, and he was a contemporary of Socrates. Um, so Socrates says that's one side of it. Your guys' criticism of my way of proceeding, and then he goes on to say, in this very peculiar formulation, which has a sort of it's sometimes said that poesis or poetry, which is originally understood as a kind of making, is the shows itself in um, uh, the peculiarly um, central practice which moves in philosophy as the making of terms of art, our terminology. But this isn't exactly simply a piece of terminology whereby, but we could give it a name and make it a piece of terminology. So Socrates says, um, there's a man who lives with me in my own household who is constantly presenting a different criticism to me, different than that of you men like Hippias and you Athenians at large, who say I just produce a hodgepodge of things which aren't really useful for anything in the way that knowing how to win at the law courts through the art of the rhetorician, as schooled by somebody like you, Hippias, who's takes pay to train people to be good at triumphing in law courts. Um, so this reference to the man who lives with him in his own household would seem to be a veiled way to speak of the daimon, or the daimonian, the genie, as it were, within, the voice within. Um, so that links to my thinking of the Lares, Lares, the Roman god of the hearth, to which each family pronounced different prayers, and to which the original, against what Rousseau says, the original meaning of property, or ousia, I think in Greek, the word used for being, ousia, not insignificantly has been taken to mean real estate, but not, but it's clear, not, we had something William Petty argued for, called laissez-faire, which is very recent to us, right? 17th century. And the idea is that instead of the oligarchs or the aristocracy being, in a way, office holders for the king, so in other words, I think it's true even later on of, in a way, because it lingered for a long time after laissez-faire came out, of Charles Dickens' family, of Darwin's family, not Dickens, but Darwin's family, the author of Bleak House, of course. This talk of gamesmanship, people who live for gamesmanship, but which I suppose is in one of the early formulations. This is kind of an early formulation of a capitalist era individual, but no, putting all that aside. So I was just trying to give an example of what laissez-faire accomplished, which is that people owned big estates, plantations, and this was in a way like an office, because the king wanted to assure that the people that had, several generations in the family of knowing how to run a state like that were in charge, and that it would simply be a regular crops would be regular. And Alan McFarlane, the Cambridge anthropologist, says really there was almost no actual famine in England for like many hundreds and hundreds of years, like one case or something in, I don't know, 700 years or something like that. The famous Irish potato famine, of course, being artificial. In other words, of people who owned stuff and said, "Oh, we stand on our rights of owning," said, "We don't have to share this with you, even though you're starving," because they could get a higher, even though the locals were willing to pay for it at a reduced price, everything they could pay. The owners of the cereals or grains said we can get a higher price abroad, so they sold it to Europe. So that's artificial, but the production of the crops was good and regular for many, many hundreds of years, because being a plantation owner, being an aristocrat, was a kind of office. It was a way of being an office holder. I say that deliberately in order to remember that the same thing is true of the oligarchs, even though Fukuyama would tell us that they're corrupt. They're actually kind of like office holders that are doing something, by and large, that's actually useful, just as the robber barons built up the country in America, which we can contrast with the rather anarchical and hit or miss, spray or pray, capitalist billionaire class, who aren't subordinated under a particular purpose, but just go out and try different stuff, whatever hits their fancy. Elon Musk tried many different ventures, some of which were useless. When laissez-faire comes in, then you break that up. So that's the transition from this sort of regular production that Adam Smith was still thinking of, and the physiocrats had been thinking of, to the what was suggested in the same period, the private vices, public benefits version of which is in its highest form, I think, in Hayek, and this notion that everybody has their own ends and knows what they know, and the total sum of the profitable knowledge of all the individuals in the country couldn't possibly be transmitted to one panoptical Utah data facility and sifted through and understood. That was absolutely so. Then, now, I think there was like an episode of Ridley Scott directed the first episode, or first two episodes, I think, of the Raised by a Wolf science fiction show. It was on like Showtime or HBO or one of those things. And in one of the later episodes, I think they had some kind of AI machine that could absolutely gather all the information and then task people every day. It would say this is the optimal use of every individual's efforts, and it would task them. And there's something kind of beautiful in there. It reminds me of the scene where um, Roger Ebert pointed out this feature in the Star Wars movies that you see kind of um, the emotions of side characters, like when the Grimorian Guard, or sorry, the some kind of monster that the Grimorian Guard was had underneath Jabba the Hutt's um, throne room that Luke Skywalker falls into, and then he kills this sort of giant dinosaur-sized monster. The guy that was the keeper, the Rancor monster, the guy that was the keeper that was seen weeping, like off in the back, just in this like tiny shot off in the background. But this little detail that keeps the thing alive is there, and um, uh, the idea of this move from an ordered situation to a disordered situation seems to be at play politically in the claim that you could go back to the ordered situation, which to some degree, not all the groups in the BRICS, but to some degree the Dugan position is about, because it's the return to the Middle Ages, right? So I could see in this move, but let me just reset, even though I got kind of off course there. Let's not go full sail off course. Let's go back to the this juxtaposition, which again is we can see in the last part of the Habeas Major, the very literally the last paragraph, as it were. I'm not sure if it's a paragraph in the original Greek, but the last saying of Socrates, and this juxtaposition of his own inner demands, which he shows as apparently this figure of the person who lives in his own household. So we could call that the householder, give it a name. And then this is what I was saying, like this would now be a technical term, a piece of poesis of a thinker. So now we have this technical subject matter of the person who dwells in the house with one, as standing for a way of giving a minimum distance between the ordinary way of describing thinking or the demands of our conscious. Like, so for instance, that I get something wrong, in the recent interview that I did with Owen and the Agon podcast, for instance, I said that Salesforce has very few employees. Then I looked at something, a paying of conscious gets you, and then you think, maybe I was wrong about that, because I didn't actually look it up. I was thinking in general about tech things, and then I look it up. I see, they actually have 80,000 employees, which is quite a lot. But the point would be that Socrates' demands of conscience are different than his contemporaries are than anyone else. And so then there's this split between the two. So I think Sloterdijk wants to, or indeed has thought a lot about this juxtaposition as a specific split, which if we would show regimes, so for instance, the Callipolis regime, which is like in Plato's Politeia, which is the regime of the Kalon, so the beautiful or noble regime, which in the beginning of the Politeia seems to be presents the philosophy as the pursuit of the Kalon, but then there's a switch in the course of the Politeia in order to present the case of philosophy as the pursuit of knowledge. And I think between this split, Heidegger sees the ground where you go from one practice into the ontotheology, into ontotheology, because you say knowledge, then you make knowledge into something central, so that you have to know about um, a specific version of the good, which for the Greeks was completion, but for the Christians was perfection. So you know this phrase like the good is, or the perfect is the enemy of good enough, something like that. Russian phrase. Um, that sort of shows the difference between Platonic version and Christian version on that score. But just having this kind of comparisons um, gives Heidegger ground to show that ontotheology is explodable and it's unreliable ground. So Sloterdijk himself, at the beginning of the talk, gives this example, which I found unusual in the way he presented it, and I wasn't sure. I kind of take it that as a sort of arch type of guy, arch intellectual, he always wants to present things slightly askew of the way they're ordinarily presented. He doesn't want to be passe or tedious by using like for instance, Zizek says, oh, instead of saying the Owl of Minerva, you said the Nighthawk of Minerva or something like that, whatever. But some little switch in an ordinary conception that seems to give it at least a little bit of maybe rhetorical new life in some sense. So was he doing this deliberately? It's a super subtle issue to try to show, but it does show how close reading and to use the sort of generic standard testing term, reading comprehension, comes into the core of these issues. He says, citing Rousseau's Emile, which I think came out like 1750 or something like that. That's probably within 20 years, let's say. This thing that's usually said about the Spartan mother, who's, I think, 3 or 4 sons, so like Saving Private Ryan, 3 or 4 sons were killed in battle, and the helot, or the slave, however that may be, came to report this, and then the mother says, base slave, I asked you not about my sons, but about the outcome of the battle. And then she finds out that there's victory, and she rushes off to make prayers pronounce prayers of gratitude, perhaps even to the goddess Helen, who was at a cult amongst the Spartans. Sloterdijk instead, so in this version, which is the most common version in how it's stated in the translations of the Emile, I don't know, like, if somebody knows, I'd be grateful if they would write in, if it's demonstrated that whether or not Rousseau made up this anecdote. I don't know. There's not a citation in the versions I can find to a classical author. Where did Rousseau hear this anecdote? Perhaps he invented it, like he did with this epistolary novel, very successfully and in a way that fooled quite a few people, or people that wanted to be fooled by it. But nonetheless, it says what he wants to say. The author Gassett did this too. He said, who was this? I think Latin American author who was blind. He said sometimes he would um, write something, and then in order to give it a kind of weight or kind of um, cachet, he would assign some ancient author to it, to the saying. I forget the name of that. The name of the guy that wrote the thing about the map that was as large as the territory, the tiny little piece that is so often mentioned. This says, but in any case, whether it's true or not, the first version seems to say is, what mattered to her most of all was the morality of Sparta, the Spartan morality. We could contrast that with something like Antigone, right? Strauss has, by the way, challenged the ordinary readings of Antigone because on the score of his expertise in natural right and in this idea of its origins. Because in Antigone, there's supposedly some Zizek addition to it. I forget, there was some wrinkle, but in the regular thing, in the regular reading of Antigone is like it's about burial, right? It's about burying her brother, and the brother is left unburied as an example, like people left to hang on the gallows and rot. But this one could say this is like the difference between customary, almost tribal thoughts of what's right, what ought to be done, as against the arbitrary acts of Creon, or of a tyrannical lawmaker, crooked-minded lawmaker, let's say. Whereas in the Spartan case, we're not talking so much about I don't know, just like something like burial, a folk thing that you could see that would stand among tribal people as much as it would stand among people in a polis. But we're talking about something specific to a life in a political community, which is something like patriotism, right? So that's a different. There's a distinction there. And we gave them names, so you could say we're doing that poesis of making terms. But then there's also, let's see, the contrast of that. Well, okay, let's leave that part on the distinction between Antigone's version and this Rousseauian version, which is possibly a superimposition of the modern nation-state, pre-nation-state difficulty, circa 1750, not that long until the French Revolution, 1789, on to antiquity. That way of stating it seems like we're talking about like patriotism in some normal sense. I don't know. But in the Sloterdijk way of thinking, it almost seems like some kind of religious cult, or I don't know, Walpurgis not or something, and it's like some kind of the claim of return to neo-fascism in the sense of almost like the George Lucas version, some kind of occult, blitz out of the clear Himmel, the brilliant Himmel. There's what he says is so the slave comes in kind of sweating, he's been running, and this sort of like a woman who's given the stature of like Livia Drusilla or something like that, like some arch uh, uh, how do you say uh, you know, elite, to use a modern word, um, power hungry person is sitting there in full dignity somehow, and yeah, she finds out that her um, sons have died, and according to the Sloterdijk version, so far as I can hear him, what he's saying is uh, this is actually what she is enchanted by this saying, your sons have died, but in the following way, in the service of winning the victory for the country. And then Sloterdijk links that to this notion of this kind of Spartan religion. In a way, he seems to be linking that to. Yeah, in the first version, it's not, and that's the customary one. It doesn't seem like she's gone to make prayers happily that her sons have died, but it's more like it's like there's a choice between her son's life and the victory of the Spartans. She chooses the victory of the Spartans, and the whole saying about either come back with your shield or come back on your shield. Don't be taken captive, or don't nothing in between. It's just that, yeah, she would have rather they came back with their shields and the victory, but it's still has to play prayers of gratitude um, for that reason, because of the victory, even though her kids died. But in his version, it's like she's all the more happy because they died the right kind of the death that would be most wanted for a mother to pray for her children to die, and to die if it was to die that way. Yeah, we generally take for granted uh, the value of life at any cost, more than which we see in exaggerated forms in people who simply live to live as long as possible, and that's their main goal, and that through um, health measures and through um, reasonable precautions in their daily life and so on. As in great contradistinction to the Japanese, who's, they still in World War II, I don't know how their attitude is now, the idea of the double suicide of young lovers. So for instance, Mishima gives this example, like, this is the kind of thing novelists are good with, by the way, that you don't learn if you don't read the thinker novelists. They'll really understand these things. Is like the example of a girl engaged to be married who found out that her husband to be had some tarnish on his spirit somehow through a foul act or something like that, whereby he would have to kill himself, and then she thinks, I will happily do double suicide with him. And it's like the normal thing in Japanese culture to think like that at that time. And this is like past the war when this takes place. So it's true, Mishima's own suicide was viewed as kind of a grotesque act and so forth by many, but that was a specific act of his choice rather than one lodged in a custom like that. So, okay, why are we going through all these long, lengthy details here? But the point is, all these issues of conscience and issues of what one takes as normal are set off against the whole political community in a way that creates in Plato's version, you see it in the sense, that's what I was trying to get to when I was talking about the politeias. You see it in the sense when um, you get a certain regime to have to be a certain way of life, and then therefore it's as though the regime has a conscience, and then that can be pitted against other things, and then um, what this means is something like uh, the czarist regime has a certain way of doing things, certain conscience, then um, yeah, the Bolsheviks have a certain way of doing it. Stalin has a certain way of doing it, and then the current uh, uh, Boris Berezhevsky um, version has its way of doing things. I mean, this oligarch system and the semi gangster system, and the necessity for Putin to carry out contract killings and such things as part of governance. Partially because in the shadow of the West, so just like people all over in China wear suits and ties, as the West has at least since Abraham Lincoln's time. I'm not sure exactly when it started, but in the same way, there's a need to kind of like you have to uh, kind of lie to kick it, I guess. You have to present yourself as being good to liberal aims, even though you're not, if you want to be in a non-embarrassed way on the world stage, negotiating with other world leaders. So that post-World War II order, in a way, sets the stage where Putin has a conflict there. Some things have to be concealed that maybe if they weren't concealed, then there would be less need for them. In addition to that, I think one can see some other issues here in this conflict of the kind of shadowing of one realm into another. But so overall, we have a split between different forms of consciousness, as exampled in a simple way with that somebody thinks, oh, I have to check this error or something like that. In another way, by the conscious that a body has to be buried, otherwise it's a great shame or whatever. And then in the ways nation states carry out their policies, presents another version. So I think Sloterdijk, in thinking of philosophy this way, takes one big dimension, which to me links up with personality theory, because personality controls conscience, moral conscience, to a large, directly, as it were, and makes for differences in them. Of course, Socrates had a different conscience than most of the Athenians, than Hippias, for instance. An example of this I saw recently was in this Elena Rosenblatt presentation of her version of liberalism, where she makes ads against this. Somebody called Dan Klein did a debate with her and brought out many much needed issues. But what was interesting is one thing he said is like, oh, you produce this brilliant hodgepodge of things, but this is how I'd rather read it, and this is how we should read it. So it was almost like he was like Hippias saying, oh, Socrates, you've investigated this and that, but what good is it? We need to know how to win law cases. And that's what Hippias get paid for, or for making good commercial deals. Hippias was also famous for conducting commercial matters to great advantage. So taken uh, from that perspective, it's as though, Dan Klein were representing the needs of the Polis, and Helena Rosenblatt the needs of specific conscience, specific moral demands for clarity on the issue. But besides from that, one thing I wanted to mention about that, which maybe we could kind of overshadow on this what's come before this, kind of let it rest on it a little bit, is this claim that once something's been conceptualized, then it has to flow into the past. Dan Klein, in criticizing the Helena Rosenblatt tact, says if you look, as she did, at the first usage of the word liberalism and who was using it, why, isn't this something like if you would look at the first time people started using the word racism, which basically it was like a bunch of people trying to shape the dominant opinion, academics, newspaper people, in the 1930s, when it became topical because of the Nazis' social Darwinism type talk. And when in the 60s it became popular, civil rights, the word racism, if you would then say, oh, this is where the word is used, and then here and here, you would be unable to then project it back into all history and say, this is where racism was happening, this is where racism was happening. So there's a moment when the idea crystallizes and becomes a subject of all the talk. Once all the talk about racism, people start saying in between like the 30s and the 60s, there's like a 30-year gap between when intellectuals were using it or whatever, and then their betters thinking people were using it, or the chattering classes, whatever, political minded people that get here. There's like a 30-year gap between that and when it became generally exploded in the usage, which you can see on the Google Ngram statistics. But yeah, isn't it necessary to say, but racism already existed before that 30-year period? So that's the difficulty with all this conceptualization and building new lenses along those lines. They then alter the consciousness the consciousness, but also the moral conscience, with science. And therefore, perhaps it's only to be expected that we get more difficulties as the so-called postmodern era unfolds and flows like a cataract with much waters bubbling over.